This is the Clyde. Now it is pretty clean. But the river has not always been clean. The clean Clyde disappeared with the Industrial Revolution. With it came shipyards, engineering shops, mills, dye makers, you name it. And the effluent from all of these filled the River Clyde. Famous industrial names are Simon's Lobnitz, Babcock's, and of course John Brown's and Yarrow's on the other side of the river. Now, with globalization, heavy industry has not disappeared, just gone elsewhere. But in their going, the Clyde has cleaned up, and now the salmon are coming back. Renfrew's always had a link to salmon. If you examine the coat of arms of Renfrew, you'll see that the flat-bottomed ships are specifically designed to fish in low-level waters. In the old days, the burghers of Renfrew, being canny people, would sell salmon unfit for consumption to the local leper colony. So salmon have always played a part in the history of Renfrew. Here is Provost Mason pulling a large salmon out of the nets on the triennial fishing outing in 1962. I think the whole idea of salmon being in the Clyde now is a fantastic story. So let's just go and find out what we can.
My name's Gino, full name's Gino Sambucci, and I'm the skipper on the Renfrew Yoker ferry.
How long have you actually worked as a ferry pilot?
Oh, about 4.5, 5 years now.
In that time, have you seen much change in the cleanliness of the Clyde?
Yeah, it seems to be getting cleaner these days. Seen some wildlife, and last year, around about February, there was about 4 or 5 seal pups coming up and lying on the slipway. It was really nice to see.
Oh yeah, I bet. And what about the salmon then? Have you actually seen salmon in this part of the Clyde?
Yeah, I've seen 1 or 2 jumping, but as far as I'm aware, they're on their way up to the Kelvin, because quite a few haven't got up the Kelvin.
This project began when I was approached by Richard Weeks. Richard had discovered some old film which showed our councillors going down the Clyde and casting nets in the river. And the purpose of that was simply to maintain ancient rights that had been granted to them by King Robert III. These rights are a complex business, but who better than Renfrew's own fishing guru, Sandy Marshall, to help us navigate through these muddy waters.
Hello, how are you doing?
Great, thank you very much for having us round today.
No problems.
Thank you.
They think that the salmon disappeared on the Clyde itself in the 1800s. There's a record of the last salmon being seen on the Clyde system, which is the River Gryfe, on the Gryfe News, which is a local paper. In 1917, there was a record of 100 salmon sitting in Colbog Farm, which is a farm just between Bridgewere and Houston. Now that was the last recorded documentation of a large body of salmon being on a river system in the Clyde. In the early days, pearls as well as salmon were in abundance in this river. In the 1100s, nearby Paisley Abbey was granted 1 fishing net for salmon and 6 nets for catching herring and 1 boat. The monks of Paisley Abbey later pleaded that they be given mackerel in their diet. They were so fed up with eating salmon. And how come that
Renfrew has the rights to fish the Clyde.
What you'll find is they're called Crown Charters. And a lot in the olden days now, we're getting back here to, you know, the 14th century, but maybe before that, the 12th century, whatever king or queen or was on the throne at these time would grant Crown Charters. If you had an earl or a lord and he'd done something good for his king or his queen, he would be given the rights to fish and take the salmon.
Salmon were used to trade inland where people had no access to salmon. And Renfrew was ideally situated. Transport was by boat up and down the Clyde. The kings of Scotland from Bruce onward revered Renfrew as a place to stay. King Robert III loved Renfrew and he loved the fishing. And he it was who gave Renfrew citizens the right to fish for salmon on the Clyde. King Robert III was a king of peace, not one of your warlike kings. So he left the ruling of the north of Scotland to his cousin, and he took himself off to his castle in Renfrew. The fight for power was on. The anarchy that broke out in the north of his kingdom was too much for Robert III. Some claimed he was illegitimate and therefore should not be king. Regardless, he was king. There is little peace for Robert. Henry IV is waiting to invade, and worst worry of all, his local Renfrew buddies are complaining about the abbey getting all the good fish. It is time to give them another charter for the sake of local peace and quiet. Robert was never a fighter, preferring the world of nature to the world of men. He returned to his beloved hunting and, of course, his fishing. So, from that day forth, the good folk of Renfrew set about fishing where they had the rights.
This was the royal borough and had the charter for the fishing rights here, and the netting would go from this all the way. They could net all the way from here at this point, any of the stations down here, and I believe as it goes down past Erskine, there is a little burn comes in. Here is this at Land Bank, and that is where the charter's rights go from this burn all the way up along this coast and all the way up to the mouth now of the Kelvin.
Oh, yes.
Oh, David, so this is the actual charter that was granted to the borough of Renfrew for the fishing rights. That's fantastic. What a document.
And it says here that this is a charter granted by Robert, King of Scots of most worthy memory, to the burgesses and community of our said borough of Renfrew and their successors, dated at Linlithgow, the 10th day of November and 8th year of the reign of the said king. Of all and hail the said borough of Renfrew, with the hail fishings of the water of Clyde, by right and use belonging to the same according to the old bounds and divisions thereof, together with the firms of the said borough.
It's excellent. It's been absolutely fantastic to see the charter. The rights to fish for salmon is a big thing in general. Not only in Scotland, but in England and Ireland and in Wales. The salmon, they run in a 4-year cycle, and the salmon will come in from the sea in their feeding grounds in the Atlantic, or come down into the the local rivers here in Scotland, and they would come in and they'll spawn.
Today we've been brought to a secret place by a bunch of people who are doing sterling, world-class work in the field of measurement of salmon.
I'm Willie Yeomans. I'm a fishery scientist, and I lead a team of 5 scientists from the Clyde River Foundation, which is a charity. We're based at the University of Glasgow, and our main interests are looking after the scientific side of the fish and fisheries across the 8 counties of the Clyde catchment, our 6,000 kilometres of river. These are last year's young. These would have been hatched about a year ago, usually about 6 centimetres long, 2.5 inches, that sort of length. What we do is we identify them and we count them, and we come back to the same sites at the same time of year every year and monitor how well the fish are doing.
Here we are downriver. Over there you can see the river leaving, coming in to join the Clyde at the old Dumbarton Rock. This marks the boundary of the rights to fish for salmon all the way from Dumbarton to the River Kelvin in Glasgow.
The actual rights that Renfrew Town Council hold, well, it's symbolic now because it's not a river as what we know it as what it used to be when they first got the rights. When they first got the rights, the river was a much shallower place with islands on it. It would have been a fantastic bit for netting fish, for having netting stations.
Though the royal Renfrew rights to fish are perhaps mostly symbolic now, the tradition of maintaining the fishing rights has achieved ceremonial status.
3 years ago it was very, very stormy. I was about to be carried ashore when there was a gust of wind, and again it was quite wavy, it was very stormy, and the gillie from the angling club who had me on his back sort of stumbled with the wind. He kicked a stone just on the bottom on the sand of the river, and over he went, and down he and I went right into about 2 feet of water. Well, of course, it caused a lot of fun. I didn't mind at all the things you remember, but it was most uncomfortable, cold water up my trouser legs. Make it look as if it was alive, Ivy. Ivy.
So the Clyde then has come from clean through to being one of the filthiest rivers in the world and back to clean again. Is this an ecological success story that others could build on?
Well, I hope it's an ecological success story that's repeated in other places. The Clyde system, Clyde is what we call a recovering river. It's like the Thames. Largely rural hinterland, lots of people. We have 1/3 of Scotland's human population in our 8 counties, but largely concentrated towards the bottom of the rivers. These rivers have cleaned up massively. There's no longer anything like the levels of pollutant going into them that there were even 20, 30 years ago. The fish, from our point of view, they are basically our panda, they're our dolphin. This large, iconic animal. We think, since 1983, they've probably recolonised about 30% of the former territory, and where we're at now, I think it's probably the best good news story in the history of freshwater biology. I can think of very few things on a bigger scale.
So Renfrew owes a great debt to Robert III of Scotland. The salmon departed, but have now returned. We may have lost much in terms of industry on the Clyde, but in return, we have regained a clean, productive river.
Great, thank you very much. Fishing Charter, I see. Thank you very much. Thank you.